6 shots, and after every single one, the man holding the gun shouted the same word: goal. That was the price of a football mistake in Colombia in 1994. Not a fine, not a transfer, not a season on the bench. 6 bullets in a car park in Medellín at 3 in the morning, 10 days after a defender stretched out a leg to cut out a cross and turned the ball into his own net. His name was Andrés Escobar. He was 27 years old. In Colombia, they called him El Caballero, the gentleman, because of how clean he played and how calm he stayed when everything around him was not calm at all. He had been engaged for 5 years. The wedding was set for later that same year, and before the tournament, reports said AC Milan wanted him. Here is the version of this story most people know. A man scored an own goal at the World Cup. He was murdered for it. End of story. Here is what almost nobody knows. The own goal was probably not the reason. The men in that car park were not angry fans, and the man Colombia's own president has now publicly named as responsible for the killing was himself shot dead in a restaurant in February of this year, 32 years later. So that is where this is going. We start in a city where a football club had become a laundry for cocaine money, where a referee was killed for a decision, and an entire National League season was simply canceled. We pass through the greatest team Colombia has ever produced, a team Pelé picked to win the World Cup, and the phone calls that told the coach which players he was allowed to pick. And we end at a table in a restaurant outside Mexico City in 2026, where the last chapter of this was written. Because the thing you have to understand about Andrés Escobar is that he did not die because of what happened on the pitch in Pasadena. He died because of what football in his country had already become years before he ever touched that ball. There is a word for it. In Colombia, they called it Narco-fútbol. And by 1994, it was not a metaphor. It was the business model. To see how a deflection turned into a death sentence, you have to go back 5 years, to a night when a referee walked out of a stadium in Medellín and never made it home. Medellín, October 1st, 1989. A referee named Alvaro Ortega had just officiated a match between Independiente Medellín and América de Cali. He made a call that let the game finish level. Hours later, he was shot dead on the street. The Colombian Federation's response tells you everything. They did not investigate and carry on. They canceled the season. 318 matches had been played. The whole thing was voided. No champion was crowned that year in a country where football was the one thing that worked. That is the environment Andrés Escobar came up in, and the club he played for sat right at the center of it. Atlético Nacional was the pride of Medellín. It was also, by that point, deeply entangled with the money of the Medellín Cartel, the organization run by a man with the same surname and no relation at all, Pablo Escobar. Cocaine money went into Colombian clubs at a scale nothing legitimate could match. Transfer fees that made no economic sense. Salaries that kept Colombian stars in Colombia instead of Europe. Stadium terraces built with cash nobody wanted to trace. And it worked. That is the uncomfortable part. In 1989, Atlético Nacional became the first Colombian club to win the Copa Libertadores. Andrés Escobar, 22 years old, was in that side. The best Colombian team anyone had seen was being funded by the worst people in the country. But the money came with a second half of the deal. When traffickers bet on matches, results stopped being sport. A referee's decision became a financial event. A defender's error became somebody's loss. And the men losing that money were not the kind of men who write angry letters. Think about what that does to a dressing room over a decade. Every young player in Medellín grew up knowing who paid for the pitch he trained on. The cars in the car park were nicer than they should have been. The men who came to watch training were not scouts. Nobody had to be told the rules because nobody ever wrote them down. You just knew. And by the time the national team was assembled, the two worlds were completely fused. René Higuita, the goalkeeper who invented the scorpion kick, the most recognizable Colombian footballer on earth at that moment, missed the 1994 World Cup entirely because he was in prison, held over his involvement in a kidnapping negotiation with a trafficker. Colombia went to the tournament without its most famous player, and the reason was not a hamstring. Escobar himself did not fit any of it. He came from a middle-class family in Medellín. His father was a banker who ran a project to get kids playing football instead of standing on street corners. Andrés was a devout Catholic who went to Mass with his mother every morning before school, until she died at 52. He was studying. He spoke carefully. He gave interviews about how Colombia was more than the headlines the world was reading about it, and he meant it. He did go abroad, briefly. In January 1990, he signed for Young Boys in Switzerland. It lasted 8 matches. By August, he was back at Nacional. That decision, coming home, is one you will want to remember, because he kept making it. He made it again in 1994. And here is the detail that makes the rest of this so hard to sit with. On the day of the murder, Escobar had a way out. After Colombia were eliminated, he could have flown to Las Vegas to stay with relatives. Half the squad scattered. He chose Medellín. He chose home. Meanwhile, the national team he came home to had just done something no Colombian side had ever done, something that turned a good team into a target. September 5th, 1993, Buenos Aires, the Monumental. Argentina had not lost a home qualifier in 33 years. Diego Maradona was in the stands. Colombia won 5-0, not 4, 5. In Argentina, in a World Cup qualifier. Argentine fans stood and applauded the visitors off the pitch, one of the strangest scenes South American football has produced. And then the expectations arrived. Pelé named Colombia as his favorite to win the World Cup. Not a dark horse, his favorite. A country that had won one knockout tie in its entire history was suddenly being told it was going to win the whole thing. In a normal footballing nation, that is pressure. In Colombia in 1994, it was something else, because there were people who had put serious money on that prediction being right. The squad arrived in the United States carrying it, and almost immediately, it started to go wrong. Colombia lost their opening match to Romania 3-1. Suddenly, the tournament favorites needed a result against the hosts. That is when the phone calls started. Before the United States match, the players received death threats. The message was specific. If the midfielder Gabriel Gomez played, there would be bombs, at his house and at the coach's. Francisco Maturana took Gomez out of the team. He later explained it in the plainest possible terms. He could not put another man's life at risk over a football match. A World Cup lineup was being picked by anonymous callers. That is the team that walked out at the Rose Bowl on June 22, 1994. A squad that had been told, in writing, that their families were reachable. 35 minutes in, John Harkes drove a low ball across the Colombian box. Andrés Escobar did what a defender is trained to do. He stretched his leg out to intercept it. The ball came off his shin, past his own goalkeeper, Oscar Cordoba, and into the net. Watch the footage, and it is the most ordinary thing in the world. A stretch, a deflection. It happens in every league, every weekend, in every country. The United States won 2-1. Colombia beat Switzerland in their final game, and it did not matter. Romania beat the Americans, and Colombia finished bottom of the group and went home. Now, this is the part where people disagree, and I think it is worth sitting with. In 2013, Maturana, the man who coached him, said flatly that Escobar's death had nothing to do with football at all. Wrong place, wrong time, in a city with a murder rate of 380 per 100,000 people. Others point at what investigators found, that the men involved that night were connected to people who had bet heavily on Colombia. One version says football was incidental. The other says football was the whole motive. Both have real evidence behind them, and neither has ever been fully proved. And what I'm about to tell you is worth the like and the subscribe on its own. On the night of July 1st, Escobar went out with friends in El Poblado in Medellín. At around 3 in the morning, he was alone in his car in the car park of a nightclub called El Indio when 3 men approached him. There was an argument. 2 of them pulled out handguns. He was shot 6 times with a .38 caliber pistol. Witnesses said the gunman shouted, "Goal, goal," after each shot. He was taken to hospital. He died 45 minutes later. The day after the murder, in London, the BBC was covering Argentina against Romania. A defender made an error. Alan Hansen, one of the most respected pundits in Britain, a man who had won everything at Liverpool, said on air that the defender wanted shooting for a mistake like that. It was a phrase English football had used casually for 50 years. It meant nothing. It had always meant nothing. The BBC issued a public apology. That is how far this reached. Within 24 hours, a stock piece of football language stopped being usable because a real defender had just been shot for a real mistake. The man who pulled the trigger was arrested that same night. His name was Humberto Muñoz Castro. He confessed the following day. He was found guilty in June 1995 and sentenced to 43 years. He served 11. The sentence was cut to 26 years under a change in the penal code, then reduced again for work and study, and he walked out in 2005. His 3 alleged accomplices were acquitted, and Muñoz Castro was not a fan. He was a driver and bodyguard for 2 brothers named Santiago and Pedro Gayon Henao, men who, according to reporting at the time, had lost heavily betting on Colombia at that World Cup. The brothers were investigated for obstruction of justice. They spent 15 months in prison without ever being brought to trial and were released. Prosecutors said Muñoz Castro had been following orders. They could not prove it to a standard that would convict. In 2015, the United States Treasury put the Gayon brothers on its blacklist for drug trafficking, naming them as members of La Oficina de Envigado, the organization that inherited what was left of Pablo Escobar's cartel. So for 32 years, that was the ending. A confessed gunman out of prison after 11 years. The men accused of ordering it never tried. A statue in Medellín. A story Colombia could never quite close. Then, on the 5th of February, 2026, in a restaurant in Huixquilucan, just outside Mexico City, Santiago Gayon Henao was shot dead. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, posted about it publicly the next day. He named Gayon as the man responsible for killing Andrés Escobar, and said the murder had destroyed his country's image in the eyes of the world. 32 years apart, in 2 different countries, both men in that story ended the same way. Neither killing was ever fully explained in a courtroom. Here is what survived all of it. Escobar's funeral drew more than 120,000 people through the streets of Medellín. In a city where violent death had become routine, where funerals were something you attended constantly and quietly, 120,000 people came out into the open for a center back. His family founded a project in his name to teach football to children who had nothing. Medellín built a statue of him and named a sports complex after him, and every year fans still carry his photograph into stadiums. In 2010, ESPN made a documentary about him and Pablo Escobar and how the 2 men's lives ran through the same city. In 2022, Netflix made a series about him. Colombia has now spent longer telling this story than Andrés Escobar spent alive. 4 years after his death, at the 1998 World Cup in France, Colombian supporters unfurled a banner with his face on it. They have never really put it away. And in a newspaper column published days before he was killed, written after the elimination, after the abuse, after he already knew what was waiting for him at home, Andrés Escobar wrote about the World Cup. He called it a rare and amazing experience. He thanked the people who had supported the team. And he finished with a line that Colombians have been repeating ever since. He wrote, "We'll see each other again soon, because life does not end here." He was 27 years old. He was months away from his wedding. And the last thing he chose to leave behind was not anger at the country that was about to kill him. It was reassurance.